The night before my wedding, my mother looked me in the eye and said, "If you walk down that aisle tomorrow, you are no longer my daughter." I walked, and she meant it. For 9 years, she meant every word. No calls, no birthdays, no meeting my kids. Just silence so loud it had a weight to it. So when she finally called, voice soft, calling me honey like nothing happened, I didn't feel relief. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Because I already knew exactly why she was calling. I'm Harper, and I grew up in a house in Phoenix, Arizona, where the temperature outside could hit 115 degrees in July, and somehow the air inside felt colder. Not always, not in ways that were obvious. My mother, Diane, was the kind of woman who could walk into a neighborhood barbecue and have every single person there convinced she was the warmest, most devoted mother they'd ever met. She laughed loud, she hugged strangers, she brought her famous lemon bars and remembered everyone's children's names. People adored her. They still do. And for a long time, that made me feel like I was losing my mind, because the woman I knew at home was different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of different you could point to and say, "Look, here is the proof." It was quieter than that. It was the way she'd go completely silent when I got a good grade, but light up like Christmas morning when my younger sister Cassidy did. It was the way she'd introduce me at church as my oldest, with this flat, almost apologetic tone, then turn to Cassidy and say, "And this is my Cassidy," like she was presenting something rare and precious. I noticed it by the time I was 8. By 12, I had a name for the feeling, even if I didn't have the words yet. I was not the favorite. I was never going to be. Cassidy wasn't a bad person. I want to be clear about that. She was just chosen. From the time she was born, my mother decided Cassidy was the one who needed protecting, the one who deserved praising, the one whose feelings mattered most in every room. Cassidy got the new car at 16. I got the lecture about responsibility and handed the keys to my dad's old Civic with a cracked dashboard. Cassidy's college was fully funded. I was told, at 17, that I should look into scholarships because money was tight. The same year my mother remodeled the kitchen with granite countertops and a farmhouse sink. I didn't say anything. I learned early that saying anything in that house only made things worse for me. My father, Gene, was a quiet man, gentle in the way that some men are gentle, not because they're strong enough to be soft, but because they've simply given up on having a voice. He worked long hours at a logistics company in Scottsdale, came home tired, ate dinner, watched television, and went to bed. He wasn't cruel. He just wasn't there, even when he was sitting right across the table from me. Whatever Diane decided, Gene nodded along to. He was less a husband and more a second shadow, hers. So when things got hard between me and my mother, Gene never stepped in. Not once. And that silence of his, that particular kind of absence, hurt almost as much as anything Diane ever said directly. I left for college at 18 and felt, for the first time in my life, like I could breathe properly. I went to Arizona State, got a degree in healthcare administration, built a small, tight circle of friends who actually saw me. And then, 2 years after graduation, working at a medical office in downtown Phoenix, I met Marcus. He was there picking up paperwork for his mother, this tall, calm, quietly funny man who held the door open and then apologized for holding it too long like it was a serious offense. I laughed. He laughed. We stood in that parking lot talking for 40 minutes without either of us planning to. By the third date, I knew he was different. By the sixth, I knew he was it. Marcus was steady in a way I had never experienced from a man. He listened when I talked, really listened, not waiting for his turn to speak. He remembered small things. He never once made me feel like I was too much or not enough. He had a good job in construction project management, a small house he was fixing up in Mesa, and a mother who actually called him on his birthday and meant it. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded it. He was better than that. He was the kind of man who noticed when you were tired before you said a word. I had never felt so seen in my entire life. And when I brought him home to Phoenix to meet my family, I already knew, deep in my gut, that my mother was going to hate him. I just didn't know how far she was willing to go. The first time Marcus came to dinner at my parents' house in Phoenix, my mother smiled at him the entire evening. That wide, warm, lemon bar smile that fooled everyone. She asked him questions about his work, complimented his handshake, told him he had good energy. Marcus drove home that night thinking it had gone well. I sat in the passenger seat staring out the window at the highway lights, saying nothing. Because I had seen that smile before. That wasn't warmth, that was assessment. Diane was deciding how much of a threat he was. And by the way her eyes went flat every time Marcus made me laugh, I already knew her verdict. The comments started small. They always do with women like Diane. It was never, I don't like Marcus. It was, don't you think he's a little too comfortable, Harper? Like he doesn't have much ambition? Or she'd call me on a Tuesday afternoon, not to ask how I was, but to casually mention that Cassidy's boyfriend had just gotten a promotion, a big one, downtown Scottsdale, corner office. Just, mentioning it. I'd hang up the phone and sit with this low, sick feeling in my stomach because I knew exactly what she was doing. She was building a case, brick by brick, quietly. The way she built every case against everything in my life she couldn't control. When Marcus proposed, a simple, perfect evening on the back patio of that little house in Mesa, just the two of us and takeout tacos and a ring he'd saved for 8 months to buy, I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I cried. He cried. We sat outside until midnight just talking about our future like it was something real we could touch. I was 31 years old, and it was the happiest night of my life. I called my mother the next morning. I don't know what I was hoping for. Some small part of me, that stubborn, hopeful part that never quite died, wanted her to be happy for me. Instead, there was this long pause on the line. And then, well, I suppose you've made up your mind then. That was it. That was my congratulations. What followed was 6 months of warfare dressed up as concern. Diane called constantly, not to help plan, but to dismantle. The venue I chose was too casual. The guest list was embarrassing, Harper. People will notice how small it is. She pushed for a church wedding even though Marcus and I weren't religious. Pushed for a reception hall she'd already picked out in Tempe. Pushed for a date that worked for her social calendar. Every conversation left me feeling hollowed out and exhausted. Marcus watched me hang up the phone one night, hands shaking, eyes burning, and he said very quietly, "Harper, we don't have to include her in any of this." And I remember thinking, I wish it were that simple. I wish cutting a mother out felt as clean as it sounds. 3 weeks before the wedding, Diane called a family meeting. That's what she called it, a family meeting, like we were a corporation voting on a merger. She sat at the head of the dining room table in that Phoenix house, Gene beside her staring at his hands, Cassidy across from me with this pained, uncomfortable look on her face. And my mother laid it out like a verdict she'd already decided. Marcus was not the right man. The wedding was a mistake. If I proceeded, I was making a choice that would damage this family permanently. She used that word, permanently, and let it hang in the air of that dining room like smoke. I looked at my father. He looked at the table. I looked at Cassidy. She looked at her hands. I was completely alone in that room full of my own family. And then, 2 days before my wedding, came the ultimatum. She called me at 11 at night, and her voice was different this time. No warmth, no strategy, just cold and flat and final. "Harper, I need you to hear me. If you walk down that aisle and marry that man, you are no longer my daughter. I will not come. Your father will not come, and this family will be done with you." I sat on the edge of my bed in my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break, shift, like something that had been leaning for years finally just settled into place. I said, very quietly, "Okay, Mom." And I hung up. And I did not cry. I just sat there in the dark of my Phoenix apartment, and I thought, she just told me exactly who she is. She just handed me the truth, and I'm going to walk down that aisle anyway. I did. 2 days later, in a small garden venue in Phoenix with string lights and wildflowers and 31 people who actually loved us, I married Marcus. My father showed up, slipped in through the back, sat in the last row. I saw him from the aisle, and for 1 second my throat closed completely. He stood up when I walked in. And then, halfway through the ceremony, before we even exchanged rings, I watched him stand up quietly, slide out the side door, and disappear. He had gotten a call. I knew whose call it was. I turned back to Marcus, and Marcus was looking only at me, steady and sure, like nothing else in the world existed. I took a breath. I finished my vows, but I felt my father leave. I felt it in my chest like a door shutting. The disownment after was not dramatic. It was administrative. Diane made calls. She told relatives in her careful, sorrowful voice that Harper had chosen a man over her family, that it broke her heart, that she had tried everything. She never mentioned the ultimatum, she never mentioned the manipulation or the 6 months of warfare. She just painted herself as a grieving mother and me as a cold, ungrateful daughter. And because she was charming and consistent and had been building that narrative for 31 years, most of them believed her. I found out through my cousin Renee that there had been a family Christmas that December, a big one, at Diane's house. Every aunt, uncle, cousin, everyone. And nobody called me. Nobody texted. I found out because Renee sent me a group photo by accident. I stared at that photo on my phone screen for a long time. All those faces. That house. That Christmas tree in the corner I had decorated every year growing up. And no Harper. No Marcus. Like we had simply never existed at all. 9 years is a long time. Long enough to build something real from nothing. Long enough to stop flinching every time the phone rings. Long enough to almost forget what it felt like to sit at that Christmas table in that Phoenix house and feel like you belonged somewhere. Marcus and I bought a house in North Phoenix, a good neighborhood with a big backyard and a lemon tree in the corner that bloomed every spring like it was showing off. We had 2 kids, a daughter, Lily, 7 years old and relentlessly curious about everything, and a son, Drew, who was 4 and had Marcus's calm eyes and my stubborn streak. We had a life, a real, full, imperfect, genuinely happy life. And I had learned, slowly, painfully, through years of therapy and quiet conversations with Marcus on that back porch, to stop measuring my worth by what my mother had decided it was. I won't pretend the 9 years were easy. There were birthdays where I'd sit with birthday cake in front of my kids and feel this ghost ache, this hollow wondering about whether Diane ever thought about them, whether she knew their names, whether she had ever, even once, felt something close to regret. Lily asked me once, when she was 5, why she didn't have a Grandma Diane like her friend Emma had a grandma who came to school plays. I told her, very carefully, very gently, that sometimes families are complicated, and that the people who show up for you are your real family. Lily accepted that with the beautiful, uncomplicated trust of a 5-year-old. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood over the sink for a few minutes before I could go back out. Some wounds don't close. They just scar over, and you learn to live around them. Then on a regular Tuesday evening in October, I was in my kitchen in Phoenix making dinner. Drew at the table with crayons, Lily doing homework on the couch, Marcus not home yet from a job site in Peoria, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it, and the name on the screen stopped me completely. Not a number I didn't recognize. A name. Mom. Still in my phone after 9 years. I don't know why I never deleted it. Maybe some part of me always knew this call would eventually come. I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand and just stared at the screen through 3 full rings. Drew looked up from his crayons. Mama, your phone. I let it go to voicemail. I put the spoon down, and I stood at that kitchen counter waiting, heart going strange and fast, until the voicemail notification appeared. Her voice on that recording was unrecognizable at first. Soft, almost fragile. The hard, controlled edges I had known my entire life were gone, replaced by something that sounded rehearsed but tired, like she'd recorded it a few times before this version. Harper, honey, it's Mom. I know it's been a long time, and I know I don't have any right to call. I've been thinking about you so much lately, about everything. I miss you, sweetheart. I miss you, and I'd really love to just talk, if you're open to it. Please call me back. I played it twice. And both times, instead of feeling the rush of longing I might have expected, instead of that little girl inside me jumping up and saying she finally called. I felt something cold and careful settle in my chest, something that had learned, after 31 years and 9 more on top of that, not to trust the soft voice. Because the soft voice always wanted something. I called my cousin Renee that same night after the kids were in bed. Renee was the only one in that family who had ever been honest with me. She was the one who sent the Christmas photo by accident, the one who called me 2 days later crying and apologizing, the one who had slowly, over the years, started to see Diane clearly. Renee, I said, my mother just called me. First time in 9 years. Tell me what's happening over there. There was a pause on Renee's end. A long one. The kind of pause that means someone is deciding how much to say. Then she exhaled, and she told me everything. Diane was in serious financial trouble. The house, that Phoenix house I grew up in, with the Christmas tree and the lemon bars and the dining room table where my mother had delivered her verdicts, was 4 months behind on the mortgage. Jean had suffered a mild stroke 8 months ago, was on disability, and could no longer work. And Cassidy, the golden child, the chosen one, the daughter whose college was funded and whose feelings always mattered most, Cassidy's marriage had collapsed 18 months ago. Her husband had left, cleaned out their joint accounts before the divorce was finalized, and Cassidy was now living back at home in that Phoenix house with 2 kids of her own and no stable income. The whole structure Diane had built, the one where Cassidy was the prize and Harper was the disappointment, had simply fallen apart. And now, with no money, no golden child to rescue her, and a husband who couldn't work, Diane had run out of options. Every other door had closed, and the only one left standing, the only one with a stable house and a steady income and a life that hadn't imploded, was me. The daughter she had disowned at her own wedding. Renee said it carefully but clearly. "Harper, Cassidy called me last week asking if I thought you'd help. She said your mom is too proud to ask directly, but she's desperate." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear in my quiet Phoenix kitchen, the house dark except for the light above the stove, and I let that land. Cassidy had called Renee to ask if Harper would bail them out. Not an apology. Not a reckoning. A calculation. And then, the voicemail. "Honey, I miss you. Please call me back." 9 years of silence, and this was what broke it. Not guilt, not love, not a single moment of genuine reflection. Just, the money ran out and Harper was the last name on the list. I didn't call my mother back that night, or the next night. I told Marcus everything, sitting on our back porch after the kids were asleep, Phoenix night air still warm even in October, the lemon tree dark and quiet in the corner of the yard. I told him about the voicemail, about Renee's call, about Cassidy asking around before Diane even picked up the phone. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting. That was always his way. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Harper, whatever you decide, I'm behind you. But don't let her rewrite history just because she's desperate." I nodded. I already knew that. But knowing something in your head and feeling it in your body when your mother is involved, those are two completely different things. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for a long time. 4 days after the voicemail, on a Saturday morning, I was in the front yard with Drew helping him water the plants when a car pulled up to the curb in front of our house. I didn't recognize it at first, a silver sedan, older, a little dusty, and then the door opened, and Diane stepped out. 9 years older. Smaller somehow, which shocked me. She had always seemed so large in my life, so consuming, that seeing her physically smaller felt almost disorienting. Her hair was shorter, more gray than I remembered. She was dressed carefully, the way she always dressed when she wanted to make an impression. Pressed blouse, good earrings. But underneath all of that careful presentation, she looked exhausted. She looked like a woman who had run out of road. She saw me across the yard, and her face did something complicated. Relief and shame, and something I couldn't quite name, all moving across it at once. Drew looked up at her, then up at me. "Mama, who's that?" I put my hand on his shoulder. "Go inside and find Daddy, okay, baby?" He went. I stood in my front yard in Phoenix and waited for my mother to walk toward me. She reached the edge of the driveway and stopped. Her hands were clasped in front of her, that same gesture Renee had described, like she was about to pray. Up close, I could see her eyes were already wet. She opened her mouth, and what came out was, "Harper, you look so good." Not "I'm sorry," not "I was wrong," not even "hello," just, "You look so good," like we had run into each other at a grocery store after a mildly awkward falling out. Something hot and sharp moved through my chest. I said, very quietly, "Diane, you should have called before coming to my house." She flinched at the name. Good. I had not called her mom in the 9 years of silence, and I was not going to start now on my own front lawn. She said, I know, and I'm sorry, I was afraid if I called you wouldn't see me." I said, "Come inside, we'll talk." Not because I was ready, because I needed walls around this conversation. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where my kids did homework and Drew colored with crayons and Marcus and I had our Sunday morning coffee. I did not offer her anything to drink. Marcus appeared in the doorway, took one quiet look at the situation, and said, "Kids and I are going to the park. Take your time." He caught my eye for just 1 second before he left. That 1 second said everything. I'm here. You're not alone. You've got this. The front door closed, and it was just me and Diane in my kitchen in Phoenix, 9 years of silence sitting between us like a third person at the table. She started to cry almost immediately. Soft, controlled tears, the kind that looked genuine but landed on me like performance because I had watched this woman cry strategically my entire life. I sat with my hands flat on the table, and I waited. She talked for a while, about how hard things had been, about Jean's stroke and the medical bills and the house, about Cassidy's divorce and how devastating it had been for the whole family. She used the word family 4 times in the first 5 minutes, and each time it landed in me like a small, deliberate cut. This family, her family. The one that had sent me a group Christmas photo I wasn't in. The one that had believed every word she said about me without ever once picking up the phone to ask my side. She cried harder and reached across the table toward my hand, and I moved my hand to my lap, not dramatically, just moved it. She noticed. The tears didn't stop, but something behind her eyes recalibrated, the way it always did when a tactic wasn't working. And that small, familiar recalibration, that tiny strategic adjustment behind the grief, was what finally settled something solid and immovable inside me. I let her finish, and then I said, Mom, first time I had used that word in 9 years. I needed it to land. I needed her to hear what came after it, clearly. Do you remember what you said to me the night before my wedding? The room went absolutely silent. Whatever she had been preparing to say next, whatever the next move in the strategy was, it stopped. Her face changed. The tears didn't disappear, but something underneath them shifted, went uncertain. She said, Harper. I said, I need you to answer me. Do you remember what you said? She looked down at the table, and in that downward look I had my answer. She remembered. Of course she remembered. You don't forget the night you tell your daughter she is no longer yours. And that was when something opened up in me that I had kept sealed for 9 years. Not rage. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't rage. It was something quieter and more devastating than rage. It was the truth. Finally walking out of the room, I had locked it in. I told her, evenly, without raising my voice, without a single tear, what that phone call had done to me, how I had stood at my own wedding with no family behind me, how I had spent the first year of my marriage grieving her while she was still alive, how Lily had asked me why she didn't have a Grandma Diane, how I had stood over my bathroom sink so my daughter wouldn't see me cry over a woman who had chosen pride over her own grandchildren. I told her about the Christmas photo. I told her about the lies she spread about Marcus. I told her that for 9 years I had done the work, the therapy, the grief, the slow and painful rebuilding of my own sense of worth, and that I had done all of it without her, and despite her. My voice stayed level the entire time. My hands stayed still. I had imagined this conversation 100 times, and in every version I had imagined I was crying. I wasn't. I was done. When I finished, Diane was very quiet. The performance tears had dried. What was left on her face was something rawer, not quite remorse, not the deep bone reckoning I had once hoped for, but something closer to the realization that the script she'd walked in with wasn't going to work here, she said, after a long moment. I know I made mistakes, Harper. I know things weren't always fair, but I'm your mother, and I need help. I don't know where else to go. And there it was, stripped of the soft voice and the clasped hands and the careful earrings. There was the actual sentence. I need help. I don't know where else to go. Not, I love you. Not, I am so deeply sorry for what I took from you. Just, I need help and you're what's left. I looked at this woman who had shaped so much of my pain, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. I felt free, because she had just confirmed, in the plainest possible language, that this visit was never about me. It was never about us. It was about money. And knowing that, hearing it stated that plainly, meant I didn't have to wonder anymore. I didn't have to hope. I didn't have to grieve what she wasn't capable of giving. I could just decide, clearly, cleanly, from a place of genuine strength instead of old hurt. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Cassidy. Harper, please. She's really struggling. We all are. You're the only one who can help right now. Please be the bigger person here. Be the bigger person. I looked at that text for 3 full seconds. Then I turned my phone face down on the table, and I looked back at my mother, and I was ready to speak. I looked at my mother sitting across from me at that kitchen table in my Phoenix home, the home I had built without her, the life I had constructed from scratch after she had made it clear I wasn't worth keeping. and I took one slow breath. Not for drama, just to make sure that what came out of my mouth next came from the clearest, steadiest part of me, and not from the wounded 12-year-old who still lived somewhere quiet in my chest. I had spent 9 years getting to this moment without knowing I was preparing for it. Every therapy session, every hard conversation with Marcus on that back porch, every night I chose to keep going instead of collapsing under the weight of what she had done. All of it had been building toward this one kitchen table in North Phoenix on a Saturday morning in October. And I was not going to waste it, I said. I'm not going to give you money, Diane. I used her name deliberately, the same way I had in the driveway, because I needed the boundary to be structural, not just emotional. Her face tightened. I kept going before she could redirect. I'm not going to give you money, and I want you to understand clearly that this is not a punishment. This is not me being cold or vengeful or holding a grudge like I know you'll tell people later. This is me being honest with you, maybe for the first time without flinching. She opened her mouth. I raised one hand, not aggressive, just firm, and she closed it again. That small moment, my mother closing her mouth because I raised my hand, felt monumental in a way I cannot fully explain. For 31 years, that dynamic had been reversed. For 31 years, she had been the one who spoke, and I had been the one who went quiet. Not anymore, not in my house. I told her that I had looked into resources the week before. Because I had. Because that's who I am. I prepare. I think ahead. I take care of things. And I slid a piece of paper across the table toward her. On it, I had written the name and number of a nonprofit housing assistance organization that worked with families in Maricopa County, and the contact information for a social worker at a Phoenix Community Services office who specialized in exactly the kind of situation her household was in: medical hardship, income loss, housing instability. I had done the research. I had made it easy. What I was not going to do was write a check that would temporarily solve a financial crisis while permanently confirming to Diane that disappearing for 9 years had no real consequence, that disowning your daughter at her wedding was something you could simply circle back from when the money ran out. That was not a lesson I was willing to fund. Diane looked at the piece of paper for a long moment. Then she looked up at me, and I saw the shift happen in real time, the grief giving way to something harder, the softness evaporating now that the strategy had clearly failed. She said, "So that's it. After everything, that's what I get. A phone number." Her voice had gone flat and cold. The voice I recognized from childhood. The voice that meant the performance was over and the real Diane was back. I said calmly, "That phone number could actually help you, if you use it. I hope you do." She pushed back from the table, stood up, straightened her blouse in that precise, composed way she always had when she was preparing to exit a situation she couldn't control. And then she said, and I want to remember this exactly because it was so perfectly, painfully her, "I didn't raise you to be this way." I looked at her. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said, very quietly, "You didn't raise me much at all, Diane. That's rather the point." She left. No dramatic slamming of doors. That would have been too honest, too raw, too much of an admission that she was the one who had lost something here. She walked out of my house the same way she had walked into it. Composed, controlled, chin up. I stood at my kitchen window and watched that dusty silver sedan pull away from the curb and disappear down the street. And then I stood there a moment longer, just looking at the empty street, the quiet neighborhood, the ordinary Saturday morning continuing around me like nothing seismic had just happened inside my house. A neighbor walked a dog past the window, a kid on a bike. The lemon tree in the backyard caught the morning light. Life, just continuing. I pressed my hand flat against the kitchen window glass, cool and solid under my palm, and I exhaled a breath that felt like it had been held for 9 years. The calls started within 48 hours. Diane had made her rounds. 2 aunts called, leaving voicemails about family and forgiveness and how life was short. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years sent a long rambling text about how Diane was devastated and how Harper had always been so strong, and surely I could find it in my heart. I read every message. I responded to none of them. And then, 3 days after Diane's visit, my phone rang, and it was Renee. I picked up immediately. Renee's voice was different from the others, quieter, more careful. She said, "Harper, I want you to know something. I've been watching your mother for a long time, longer than I admitted to myself. And after everything that's happened these past few weeks, Watching her work the phones, watching her spin this, seeing how she talked about you to everyone while she was planning to show up at your door. I see it now. All of it. I should have seen it 20 years ago, and I'm sorry that I didn't. I sat down on my kitchen floor when she said that, just sat right down on the tile. Not because I was devastated, because I was relieved. Because being truly seen by someone from that world, someone who had been inside those Christmas photos I wasn't in, someone who knew the full cast of that family story, it mattered more than I had realized it would until the moment it happened. Renee and I talked for 2 hours that afternoon. She told me that several of the older relatives, the ones who had known Diane the longest, had started quietly comparing notes in the weeks since Diane had begun making her calls asking for help. Apparently, when you call enough people asking for money and sympathy, patterns start to emerge. Aunt Carol had mentioned to Renee that Diane's version of the wedding story had changed slightly depending on who she was telling it to. A detail here, an emphasis there, small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a picture of a woman who had been carefully managing a narrative for years. The relatives who had once looked at me with polite, distant sympathy. Poor Diane, her daughter just abandoned her? Were starting to ask different questions, quietly, carefully. But they were asking. And in a family like mine, in a dynamic like the one Diane had built and maintained for decades, even quiet questions were a form of revolution. Cassidy called once more, 2 weeks after Diane's visit. It was a short call. Her voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with genuine exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who had been the golden child long enough to realize that the throne had never been real, that she had been propped up not because she was loved more deeply, but because she was more useful to Diane's image. She didn't ask me for money this time. She said, "I don't expect you to help. I just wanted to say, I know things weren't fair with us growing up. I know that." It wasn't an apology exactly. It wasn't the full reckoning that a therapist might say I deserved, but it was something. It was Cassidy, finally, choosing honesty over loyalty to a narrative. I said, "I appreciate you saying that, Cassidy. I really do. Take care of yourself, okay?" And I meant it. I genuinely meant it, because I was done carrying anger toward my sister. She had been trapped in that dynamic just as surely as I had. Differently, with more comfort and less pain, but trapped nonetheless. What Diane had done to our family had damaged both of us, just in different ways. Marcus came home from the park that Saturday with 2 very sandy children and a bag of tacos. Because, of course he did, because that was Marcus. And he found me still in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. He looked at me. Just looked. The way he always did, reading the room before he said a word. Then he set the tacos down, sent the kids to wash their hands, and sat across from me in the chair where Diane had been sitting an hour before. How'd it go? I looked at him. This steady, quietly funny man I had chosen over everything, the man my mother had called unambitious, the man who had stood in a parking lot with me 40 minutes talking about nothing and everything, and had been showing up ever since. I said, "I think I'm okay. I think I'm actually really okay." He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. Not dramatically, just there, present, solid, the way he had always been. And I thought, this is what I walked down that aisle for. This is what I chose. And I would choose it again every single time. I want to talk to you for a moment. Not as someone who has it all figured out, because I don't. And anyone who tells you they've completely healed from a mother like Diane is leaving something important out. But as someone who has been sitting with this long enough to know the difference between the woman I was the night before my wedding and the woman I was at that kitchen table 9 years later, and that difference, that distance between those 2 versions of Harper, is the only thing I want to share with you right now. Because if you're watching this, there's a good chance you already know what it feels like to love someone who uses that love against you. And I want you to know that what you're feeling is real, it is valid, and it is not the whole story of your life. The first thing I had to learn, and it took me years, genuine hard-won therapy-assisted years, was the difference between guilt and love. Because when you grow up in a home like mine, those 2 things get so tangled together that they become almost indistinguishable. I felt guilty every birthday she missed. I felt guilty when Lily asked about her. I felt guilty on holidays and Sunday mornings and random Tuesday afternoons when a song came on that reminded me of something. And for the longest time I mistook that guilt for love. I thought the ache meant I needed her, that it meant something unfinished between us that only she could close. It took a long time and a very patient therapist to help me understand that guilt and love are not the same thing. Guilt is what happens when someone spends years making you responsible for their emotions. Love is what Marcus does when he puts his hand over mine at a kitchen table. I had confused the two for most of my life. Learning to tell them apart changed everything. The second thing I learned was harder. I had to grieve a mother who was still alive. And I don't think people talk about that enough. The specific, strange, gutting grief of mourning someone who is still walking around on this earth, still calling people on the phone, still making lemon bars and smiling at neighborhood barbecues. You can't have a funeral for it. You can't get condolences for it. People don't bring you casseroles when your living mother has decided you don't exist. But the grief is real. It is as real as any grief I have ever known. And what I learned, slowly, imperfectly, is that you have to let yourself grieve it fully before you can move through it, not around it, not over it, through it. Every tear I did not cry on my wedding day eventually had to be cried somewhere. Better to cry it with a therapist and a husband who loves you than to carry it sealed inside you until it poisons everything good in your life. The third thing, and this is the one I most want you to hear if you are in the middle of your own version of this story, is that waiting for them to change will cost you years you cannot get back. I spent so much of my 20s and early 30s with this low background hum of waiting for Diane to call, waiting for her to realize, waiting for the version of my mother that I needed her to be to finally show up and apologize and make it make sense. And she never did. And when she finally called, 9 years later, it wasn't because she had changed, it was because she had run out of other options. The call I had been half waiting for my entire adult life turned out to be a transaction dressed up as tenderness. And the only reason I was strong enough to see it clearly was because I had, somewhere along the way, quietly, without a single dramatic announcement, stopped waiting. I had chosen my life over the hope of her approval. And that choice, made slowly and imperfectly over many years, was the most important thing I ever did for myself. I am not going to tell you to cut your mother off. I am not going to tell you to forgive her either, not on any timeline that isn't yours, not in any way that costs you your peace. What I am going to tell you is this. You are allowed to love someone and still refuse to be harmed by them. You are allowed to grieve the family you deserved without letting that grief become the thing that defines you. You are allowed to build something real and good and stable with the people who actually choose you. And to let that be enough. To let that be more than enough. Lily and Drew will never spend a single day of their lives wondering if their mother loves them. Marcus will never have to guess where he stands with me. The cycle that started long before Diane, that ran through her and into my childhood and tried to follow me into my adult life, it stops with Harper. Right here in this North Phoenix house with the lemon tree in the backyard and the crayons on the kitchen table. It stops with me. And if you are someone who has been sitting with a wound that a parent gave you, I want you to know that it can stop with you too. Not perfectly, not without pain, but it can stop. And the life on the other side of that decision is more real and more yours than anything you will ever get from waiting for someone who cannot give you what you need. You deserve the real thing. You always did. If you made it here, all the way to the end of Harper's story, I want you to know something. You didn't stay because it was just a story. You stayed because some part of it lived inside you too. Maybe it was the Christmas photo you weren't in. Maybe it was the ultimatum dressed up as love. Maybe it was the phone call that came 9 years too late and for all the wrong reasons. Maybe it was just the feeling of standing in a room full of your own family and being completely, utterly alone. Whatever it was that kept you here, that recognition, that ache of I know exactly what that feels like, that is not nothing. That is everything. And it means you are not as alone in this as it has felt. If Harper's story touched something real in you today, I want to ask you to do one small thing before you scroll away. Leave a comment below. Not a long one, just one word or one sentence, describing the moment in this story where you thought that's me. Just that. Because there is someone else who is going to read your comment and feel less alone because of it. That is how this community works. That is what this space is for. We don't fix each other here. We just witness each other. And sometimes that is the most powerful thing one person can do for another. If this story meant something to you, share it with one person, just one, who you think might need to hear it today. Not because we need the views, but because somewhere out there is a woman sitting with a wound she thinks is too specific. too complicated, too shameful to talk about. And your share might be the thing that reminds her that her story deserves to be told too. Hit the like button if you believe that people who build real lives after real betrayal deserve to be celebrated. And subscribe if you want to stay in this space, because we tell these stories every single week. Stories about women who walked through fire inside their own families and came out the other side not perfect, not unscathed, but standing. Fully, quietly, powerfully standing. Harper is still in that North Phoenix house. The lemon tree bloomed again this spring. Lily is 8 now and relentlessly curious about everything. Drew has his father's calm eyes and his mother's stubborn streak, and has recently decided that crayons are for babies and graduated to watercolors. Marcus still notices when Harper is tired before she says a word. And Diane? Well, Diane has the phone number. What she does with it is up to her. But Harper's door, her real door, the one that matters, that one is open only to the people who have earned the right to walk through it. And that, after everything, is exactly how it should be. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And if no one has told you lately, the fact that you are still standing, still building, still choosing to show up for the people who actually see you, that is not small. That is everything. See you next time.